When 14-year-old Mara walked into the police station bleeding, she didn't ask for help. She confessed and begged them not to arrest her little brother. When 14-year-old Mara walked into the police precinct, everything stopped. Not the way it does in movies, no dramatic freeze, no soundtrack dropping out. It was subtler than that. Conversations thinned. A chair stopped scraping halfway back. Someone's radio crackled once and then went quiet, like it had learned to listen. Her shoes left faint wet prints on the tile rain or tears. No one could tell. Each step echoed too loudly in the long hallway, the sound bouncing off beige walls that had seen worse things than this, and had learned not to react. She moved like someone bracing for impact, shoulders drawn in, chin tucked, as if the air itself might strike her. A deep cut split her lower lip, already swelling and darkening, the kind of injury that didn't come from falling off a bike. She kept one arm wrapped tight around her ribs, fingers digging into fabric like she was holding herself together by force alone. Her jacket was too thin for the weather, sleeves frayed at the cuffs, zipper half broken. It hung on her frame like it belonged to someone smaller or someone younger. The desk sergeant glanced up, ready to recite a script he'd said 1,000 times before. Mara didn't let him finish. She stepped closer to the counter, palms flat against its scarred surface, knuckles pale. For a second, it looked like she might change her mind, like she might turn around, run back into the rain, disappear into the streets where fear at least made sense. Instead, she lifted her chin. Her voice shook not with confusion, not with doubt, but with effort. The kind it takes to say something you've practiced in your head because you know once it's out, you can't take it back. "I did it," she said. The words landed wrong. Too calm, too deliberate. A few officers exchanged looks. One of them straightened, suddenly alert. Another tilted his head, studying her the way you study a puzzle piece that doesn't seem to fit the box. Mara swallowed hard and went on, louder now, as if volume might keep the truth from slipping away. "Please don't take my brother. That did it." A woman at the far desk stopped typing. A detective near the glass leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing not in suspicion yet, but in focus. The sergeant's pen hovered above the blotter, unmoving. "How old are you?" someone asked. 14, Mara answered without hesitation. She hadn't had to think about that part. Her gaze stayed fixed straight ahead, not meeting anyone's eyes. If she looked at them, really looked, she might see something that made her stop. Pity, doubt, hope, any of those would ruin what she was trying to do. The cut on. Her lips split a little more when she pressed her mouth closed, a bead of red welling up. She didn't wipe it away. "I broke the window," she added quickly, like she was afraid they'd interrupt. "I took the bag." He didn't know what was happening. He just followed me. The words sounded rehearsed because they were. She had built them carefully, stacked one on top of the other, practicing in her head until they felt solid enough to stand on. If she said them exactly right, maybe they would hold. No one moved. No one told her to sit down. No one reached for handcuffs. They were all still trying to reconcile the girl in front of them, the shaking hands, the bruised mouth, the way she kept glancing toward the door with the confession she was offering like a shield. And in that quiet, suspended moment, something irreversible began. Not the paperwork, not the investigation, but the slow, uneasy realization settling into the room that whatever had happened out there, whatever crime had brought her through these doors, this child hadn't come to save herself. She had come to stand in front of someone else, and none of them yet understood the cost of that choice. At this was a place where confessions were weighed, not comforted. The building itself seemed designed to remind people of that. Fluorescent lights hung overhead, casting everything in a pale, unforgiving glow that flattened faces and drained warmth from skin. Radios crackled with half-heard codes and clipped voices, the sound bouncing off walls that smelled faintly of disinfectant, old coffee, and rain-soaked fabric. Somewhere deeper in the precinct, a door slammed. Somewhere closer, a printer whined and spat out paper like it was tired of carrying bad news. People learned very quickly here that truth didn't always save you. Sometimes it just made things official. Kids didn't belong in places like this. Everyone in the room knew it, even if no one said it out loud. The chairs were built for adults, the counters too high, the language too sharp. Children brought noise, uncertainty, emotion, things this place worked hard to keep at bay. Especially kids like Mara. She stood out not because she was loud or disruptive, but because she was trying so hard not to be. Too thin for her jacket, which hung off her shoulders like it had been borrowed and never returned. The zipper teeth didn't quite line up, leaving a gap that let cold air in. Her hair was uneven, blunt in some places and jagged in others, as if someone had cut it quickly. Without a mirror, maybe without patience, it framed her face in a way that made her look younger than 14, not older. Her eyes didn't settle on people the way most kids' eyes did. They flicked to doorways, to hall corners, to the strip of windows by the holding rooms. Exit first. Always exit first. The kind of habit you develop when you've learned that staying aware is safer than staying hopeful. There were 9 officers in the room, though it felt like more. Uniforms and badges created the illusion of numbers, of authority stacked on top of itself. The detectives lingered near the glass partition, pretending to review a file that hadn't existed 5 minutes ago. One lieutenant stood off to the side, arms crossed, jacket still on. He hadn't sat down yet, as if committing to a chair meant committing to an outcome. The others filled in the gaps by the desks, near the lockers, in the slow orbit that formed around a situation no one wanted to mishandle. They all noticed the same thing at once, not the bruised lip, not the way her hands trembled when she unclenched them, not even the fact that she was standing there alone. It was what she didn't say. She never asked for a lawyer. Most adults did, even when they swore they had nothing to hide, even when they were innocent. Especially then. The word lawyer usually came early, sharp and offensive, a line drawn in the conversational sand. Mara didn't draw any lines. She never asked for her mother, either. No shaky "can I call my mom?" No pause where fear finally cracked through bravado. The absence of that request landed heavier than if she had screamed it. She only asked about her brother, not where he was, not if he was scared, just quietly, urgently whether he was still outside. That single question shifted the temperature in the room. A detective exchanged a glance with the lieutenant. One officer cleared his throat, then thought better of speaking. The radio seemed louder suddenly, more intrusive, like they were interrupting something fragile. Suspicion didn't arrive in a rush. It settled slowly, like dust in a room that hadn't been disturbed in years. It coated the air, softened the edges of certainty, made everyone hesitate before moving. This wasn't how guilt usually looked, and it wasn't how innocence usually sounded. Mara stood there, waiting, eyes still tracking exits, shoulders tense beneath that too-thin jacket, offering herself up with the quiet determination of someone who believed that, if she could just stand in the right place, take the right weight, maybe everything behind her would be spared. No one said it yet, but every person in the room felt it forming. This confession wasn't meant to end something. It was meant to protect someone. The older detective shifted his weight, then crouched slightly, careful not to loom. It was a small choice, almost invisible, but it changed the shape of the moment. He had learned long ago that height could feel like accusation. "Who hurt you?" he asked, voice low, nodding once toward her split lip. Mara shrugged. It was a reflex, not a decision. The kind of movement kids make when they've learned that answers invite consequences. Her shoulders rose and fell, tight and practiced, like she was bracing for something that hadn't happened yet. Kids who've learned not to trust adults always do that. They make themselves smaller. They turn pain into background noise. "It doesn't matter," she said quickly. Quickly. "Just write it down. I broke the window. I took the bag." He didn't know. She said it the way you recite something you've memorized under pressure. Words stacked neatly so they wouldn't collapse. Her gaze dropped to the detective's notepad. Tracking the pen like that was where the real danger lived. The detective asked. Just one word. Neutral. Open. Her jaw tightened so hard it trembled. "My brother's 11, she said. He gets scared easy." She swallowed after that, throat working, like she hadn't meant to say quite so much. Her hands balled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. The detective noticed the way her knuckles whitened, noticed how she didn't cry even as her breathing went shallow. Silence stretched between them. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that presses in from all sides, daring someone to feel it. An officer shifted near the door. Somewhere, a phone rang and went unanswered. The detective didn't rush her. He'd seen what happened when adults rush kids like this. They shut down. They disappeared behind walls you couldn't climb without breaking something. Mara stared at the floor. Then, barely louder than a breath, she added, "Our dad used to say it was my job to stand in front." The words slipped out sideways, like they hadn't been meant for the room at all, like they'd been tucked away somewhere deep and sharp, only to catch on the way past. The detective froze, not outwardly. His face stayed still, but something behind his eyes shifted. He had heard a lot of explanations in his career: anger, greed, panic, but this one carried a different weight. It wasn't justification. It was instruction, a rule learned early and enforced often. Mara's breathing hitched. She hadn't planned on saying that. You could see it in the way her lips parted slightly, in the flash of alarm that crossed her face. She tried to pull the words back, tried to smooth over the cracks she made. It's fine. She rushed on. I can handle it. I always do. But that was when she broke. Not loudly, not with sobs or screams that happened in pieces. Her shoulders sagged, just a fraction, like she'd been holding them up for too long. Her voice lost its edge, the careful sharpness dulling into something raw. Tears gathered but didn't fall, blurring her vision until she blinked hard, furious at herself for letting them show. I didn't think. She started, then stopped, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She shook her head once, as if to clear it. The fight to stay composed was written all over her face, every muscle working overtime to keep the rest in. I just didn't want him to be afraid, she said finally. That was the truth, simple, unpolished, no longer rehearsed. The detective straightened slowly, setting his pen down. He didn't write anything. In that moment, it became painfully clear that Mara hadn't walked into the precinct because she believed in justice. She had walked in because she believed fear could be redirected, that if she stepped far enough forward, stood tall enough, took the blow cleanly, the person behind her might be spared. And for the first time since she'd arrived, the adults in the room understood something vital. This child wasn't confessing to a crime. She was fulfilling a promise she never should have been made to keep. An officer broke the stillness by sliding a paper cup of water across the counter toward her. The cup scraped softly against the laminate, the sound oddly loud in the quiet room. Mara looked at it for a moment, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch it. Another officer stepped closer and, without saying a word, held out a clean cloth, white, unstained, an offering that didn't come with instructions. After a beat, Mara took it and pressed it carefully to her lip, wincing when it stung. Small things, but they mattered. Someone near the back muttered, not quite under his breath, we can't just let her decide this. It wasn't said unkindly. It was said the way rules speak for you when you don't want to take responsibility for what's in front of you. For a moment, it seemed like the room might slide back into familiar grooves. Protocol, paperwork, the safe comfort of distance. The detective's pen hovered again. An officer shifted his weight, already halfway to resuming the routine. Then the lieutenant finally sat down. The chair creaked under his weight, the sound cutting cleanly through the tension. He hadn't sat since Mara walked in, and everyone noticed the change. Sitting meant commitment. It meant staying. He rested his forearms on the table, eyes on Mara, not the file that was being assembled around her, not the imagined version of events, just her thin shoulders, clenched hands. The way she pressed the cloth to hard against her lip like pain was something she could control. If she tried, this wasn't about procedure anymore. Procedure could handle crimes. It could sort timelines, assign charges, move bodies through systems. But this moment wasn't asking for sorting. It was asking who they were going to be when no one was watching, when there would be no headlines, no commendations, no clear right answer to point to later. The lieutenant exhaled slowly. Mara, he said, using her name for the first time. She flinched slightly at the sound of it, then looked up. If you're protecting someone, he continued, voice steady, you don't have to do it alone. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Mara frowned, confusion flickering across her face. The idea didn't fit with the rules she knew. Protection, as she understood it, was solitary. You stood in front. You took the hit. That was the deal. I'm fine, she said automatically. I can handle it. The lieutenant didn't argue. He didn't contradict her or push. He simply waited. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. Less sharp, less threatening. Her fingers loosened around the cloth. She took a careful sip of water, hands trembling just enough to notice. The cup rattled softly when she set it down. You don't know him, she said after a moment. He cries when he thinks he's in trouble. He won't talk to anyone if he's scared. She said it like a warning, like she was explaining consequences. The lieutenant nodded once. Then we'll make sure he's not alone either. That was when it happened. For the first time since she'd walked through the door, since she'd chosen this path, Mara hesitated. It was barely visible. A pause between breaths. A shift in her posture. Her eyes flicked, not to the exits this time, but to the faces around her. She looked at the detective who had crouched to meet her height, at the officer who'd offered water, at the lieutenant who had finally chosen a chair. The certainty she'd arrived with wavered. What if? She started, then stopped. Her voice faltered, the confidence draining out of it. What if I'm wrong? The question hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. No one rushed to answer it, because everyone in that room understood what it meant. If she was wrong, then everything she carried alone, every rule she'd learned, every promise she kept might finally be set down, and that meant the adults would have to pick it up. The lieutenant leaned back slightly, not retreating, just making space. Then we'll figure it out, he said. Together, Mara stared at him, really looked this time. And for the first time, uncertainty softened her face, not fear, not resistance, but something new and dangerous. Hope. It scared her more than anything else she'd said all day. By evening, everyone knew. They knew about the girl who had stood in front when she didn't have to, about the brother who had been small enough to hide behind her, about the system that almost let it pass quietly. Outside the precinct, a few people gathered, not to protest, not to demand answers, but because something about the story had reached into them and refused to let go. Someone brought coffee. Someone else brought a jacket Mara's size. Inside, she sat quietly, unaware of how far the ripple had spread. She thought she had failed, thought the shield she built had cracked. She didn't yet understand that the city wasn't watching because she confessed. They were watching because she'd shown them who she was. That day, the city learned her name, not as a suspect, not as a headline, but as the girl who chose love over fear and forced everyone else to choose what they would do with. That truth change didn't happen all at once. There was no single morning when everything felt fixed. No clean line between before and after. What changed came in pieces so small they might have gone unnoticed if you weren't paying attention. It happened in court dates that ended differently than expected. The first hearing was short, procedural, the kind that usually left people hollowed out. But this time, the judge listened longer than required, asked questions that weren't on the page. The charges shifted, then softened, then were set aside entirely where they belonged. Mara sat at the table, hands folded, eyes forward, bracing for impact that never came. When it was over, she didn't smile. She just exhaled, like someone setting down a weight they hadn't realized could be lifted. It happened in a teacher staying late to help with math. Not because Mara asked, she never did, but because the teacher noticed the way she lingered at her desk, erasing and re-erasing the same problem. The classroom lights dimmed automatically while they worked through fractions and word problems, the world narrowing to numbers and pencil marks. For once, no one told her to hurry. For once, someone waited until she understood. It happened in a social worker who didn't give up this time. She showed up when doors stayed closed. She called again when messages went unanswered. She learned the difference between resistance and fear. Slowly, trust took shape, not as something given freely, but as something earned through repetition. Forms were filled. Appointments were kept. Promises, this time, were followed through. It happened when the detective who first crouched down stopped drinking after work. He didn't announce it. There was no speech. He just started going home instead of to the bar, sitting at his kitchen table with the case file open, reading it like it was asking him something. He signed up for training he'd ignored for years, volunteered for juvenile cases, learned to listen without trying to fix things fast. It happened when the lieutenant started a youth outreach program and used Mara's case as the reason. Not her name, not her face, just the story stripped of spectacle, heavy with responsibility. He told it to rooms full of officers and social workers and teachers, reminding them that systems didn't fail all at once either. They failed in small moments of inattention. The program started small, a few afternoons a week, but it kept going. It happened in Riot's home. In the quiet of the car. Windows cracked just enough to let fresh air in. No sirens, no rush, just the hum of tires on pavement. Sometimes Mara stared out the window. Sometimes her brother leaned his head against the seat and fell asleep. Before they reached their street. It happened in meals eaten quietly, not the heavy silence of fear, but the gentle kind where words weren't required. Plates passed, water poured. Someone remembered to ask how school went and waited for the answer. Mara learned that quiet didn't always mean something bad was coming. It happened in a brother who finally slept through the night. At first, he woke up crying, convinced he'd done something wrong, convinced he was about to be taken away. Mara would sit on the edge of his bed, rubbing circles into his back, whispering the same reassurance over and over. Slowly, the nights grew longer, the wake-ups fewer. One morning, she realized he'd slept until sunrise. She stood in the doorway and watched him breathe, chest rising and falling evenly, unafraid, That was when it hit her. This was what change looked like. Not dramatic, not loud, just a steady accumulation of moments where someone showed up when it would have been easier not to. And in those moments, something inside Mara began to loosen. The rules she lived by stand in front. Take the hit started to fade. In its place, something unfamiliar took root. The idea that maybe protection didn't always mean sacrifice. Sometimes, it meant letting others carry the weight too. At the adoption hearing, because yes, there was one, the courtroom felt different than Mara remembered. It wasn't quieter. Courtrooms were never truly quiet. Papers still rustled. Someone coughed behind her. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. But the air didn't press down on her chest the way it used to. It didn't feel like a place designed to decide her fate without asking who she was. She sat at the table, feet planted carefully on the floor, fingers laced together so tightly her knuckles ached. Across the room, her brother swung his legs under his chair, the movement small and nervous, like he wasn't sure yet that this kind of room could hold good things. When the judge looked up and asked, "Mara, would you like to say anything?" The question landed heavier than any accusation ever had. For a second, she considered shaking her head. Silence had kept her safe for a long time. Silence was familiar, but her brother looked at her then, not with fear, not with apology, with trust. So she stood. Her hands shook the same way they had in the police precinct months before. Not because she was scared of what would happen to her, but because she was standing somewhere she had never stood before. Out in the open, unshielded. Seeing she cleared her throat once. Then again, "I thought being brave meant taking the punishment," she said. Her voice wavered. But it didn't break. The words felt heavier now that she wasn't using them to protect herself or anyone else, just to tell the truth. "I thought if I stood in front long enough," she continued, eyes fixed on the judge, but somehow seeing every face in the room. "Nothing bad could reach the people behind me." Her fingers unclenched, slowly, like she was letting go of something she'd been gripping for years. "But I learned," she said, pausing, breath catching just slightly. "Being brave can also mean telling the truth and letting someone stand with you." The words echoed softly, not loud enough to demand attention, but strong enough that no one could ignore them. Her brother stared at her. Not the way kids look at heroes in books or movies, but the way you look at someone who has always been your sky. Suddenly realizing how vast it really is, his eyes shone, wide and unblinking, like he was afraid if he looked away, she might disappear. To him, she wasn't the girl who had walked into a police station bleeding and terrified. She was the person who had always come back for him, who had always stood between him and the worst of the world. And now, the person who was teaching him without even meaning to that you didn't have to be alone to be strong. The room didn't make a sound. No chairs moved. No pen scratched paper. Even the judge sat still, hands folded, eyes softening in a way that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with humanity. Mara swallowed and sat back down, heart racing, unsure if she'd said too much or not enough. Her brother leaned toward her and whispered, barely audible, "You're really brave." For the first time, she smiled. Not the careful, guarded kind, the real one, the kind that reaches your eyes. The judge cleared his throat at last, voice steady but warmer than before, and continued with the proceedings. Words like permanency and best interest floated through the room, but Mara barely heard them. She was watching her brother, watching the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his foot stopped bouncing, watching the future quietly click into place. When the decision was read, there were no gasps, no dramatic reactions, just a collective exhale, like a room full of people realizing they'd been holding their breath together. Mara closed her eyes for a moment. She had walked into that precinct believing bravery meant sacrifice. She walked out of this courtroom knowing something far harder and far more beautiful. Bravery could also mean staying. And letting yourself be chosen to. Today, Mara keeps the original police badge sticker the lieutenant gave her in a small box under her bed. The box isn't special. Cardboard, soft at the corners. The lid doesn't close all the way unless you press it down just right. Inside, there are a few other things: a folded note from a teacher, a photo that didn't quite come out centered, a library card with her name spelled correctly for once. But the sticker is always on top, its edges slightly worn, the adhesive long gone. Not because it reminds her of fear. She's had enough reminders of that. She keeps it because it marks the moment something shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, the moment the world proved it could bend toward her instead of away. Sometimes, late at night, She takes the box out and sets it on her bed. Her brother sleeps in the next room now, door cracked open, breathing steady. That alone still feels like a small miracle. She listens for it the way you listen for proof. The sticker catches the light from her lamp. Dull gold against white. It isn't a symbol of authority to her. It's a symbol of interruption, of a system pausing long enough to see a child instead of a case. That was the moment adults finally showed up. Not all at once. Not perfectly, but enough. They showed up in offices and courtrooms and classrooms. They showed up in follow-through, in restraint, in the choice to ask one more question instead of closing a file. And because of that, the role Mara had lived by for most of her life lost its grip. Stand in front. Take the hit. That role no longer defines her. These days, she stands differently. She raises her hand in class even when she's not sure she has the right answer. She lets her brother walk a few steps ahead of her now, just to see how it feels. She asks for help, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes too late, but she asks. The world hasn't become gentle. She knows that. She's not naive enough to think one good ending fixes everything. But she's learned something quieter and stronger, that showing up matters. Not in grand gestures or viral moments, but in the ordinary, often invisible choices people make when no one is keeping score. In listening, in staying, in deciding that a child doesn't have to earn protection by sacrificing themselves. That's how this story really ends. Not with a courtroom ruling or a headline fading from memory, but with a girl who no longer believes she has to disappear to keep someone else safe. So here's the question that lingers long after the details blur. What would you do if a child took the blame to protect someone they loved? Would you follow procedure and look away? Or would you pause long enough to see what's really being asked of you? Because sometimes, the most important moment doesn't arrive with certainty or clarity. It arrives looking like a scared kid at a counter, a trembling voice, a choice that shouldn't belong to them, and what happens next depends on who decides to show up. Be someone who shows up.